we will continue our discussion of MVC by looking at Angular. Now, just before we dive into Angular, there are two things I'd like to tell you about Knockout, which is pretty cool. So there was a question from someone in the audience that asked, can we ourselves register a listener to Knockout? Hang on, what's that seem to? So what you can do is, right, an observable is a function, right, which we learned last time, which if you call it will give you the value. If you call it with a value, with an argument, it will write that value, right? So you can use it sort of as a get and a set. What you can also do, and this is what Knockout does underneath, is, so in this case, total is an observable, right? In this case, it's actually a computed observable. You can just do dot subscribe. What dot subscribe will do is it will add an event listener to that observable. So that if this observable ever changes, it will call the function you gave it. This is what Knockout actually does under the covers in the library, right? But you have access to this too. And we'll see that Angular also has this kind of functionality where you yourself programmatically can add a listener to the model. So that's one piece of information I wanted to make sure you knew. The second thing, and this is one of the things that I think makes Knockout really powerful, is that you can specify custom bindings. What do I mean by custom bindings? Well, in Knockout, if you remember, there was a language where we would do like data bind, and then we would do something like value, and then some observable, right? So what we're saying is bind to this the result of getting a value from this observable. Can everyone see, by the way, is the font big enough back there? Test the nitro. How's that? Okay. So this is saying, take the value of this and bind it to this attribute, right? But this attribute is native to an input element, right? Now suppose you wanted to bind some data to a Google map, okay, which is clearly not native to a browser, right? A browser itself doesn't have an element called Google Maps, right? Google Maps is just, you know, some library that you can inject in that will add a whole bunch of stuff to your DOM and draw a map. So the question is, how could you use Knockout to bind to something like that, something that is not native? Well, Knockout doesn't know how to bind to Google Maps. But what you can do is you can define what are known as custom bindings. What a custom binding is you make something up. So in this case, I've made up this thing called custom show. There is no custom show. That did not exist before, right? A browser has no idea what a custom show is. But I've created it. And what I'm saying is bind this value to custom show. And what is custom show? How did I define it? What is this? So what you do is you do ko.bindingHandlers. So Knockout has a list of binding handlers. So value, for example, was an example of a handler. Okay. I can make up my own. So in this case, I'm attaching another binding handler, my custom binding handler, which I'm calling custom show. Okay. Now the body of it will contain two functions, an init function and possibly an update function. Now let's look at what this actually does. So the init function takes an element and a value accessor. So a value accessor is basically your observable. It's the thing that allows you to access the value. Okay, value accessor. So in the initialization, what I do is I call the value accessor to get some value, and then I just say, is that value truthy? If it is, I fade a particular element in. If it's falsy, I fade that element out. Update is called whenever the value accessor changes. In other words, whenever the observable fires the event that says I have changed, that will call my update function. And in there, I have the same kind of logic. I get the value, and I say, is this truthy? If it is, I fade in. If it's not, I fade out. And so, if I do... Oh, right. So the expression that specifies whether we're fading in and out is this. So we're getting the value, which is whatever value is bound to here, checking is it greater than 10. So is this truthy or falsy? So the idea is, if it's greater than 10, say 12, I'm going to fade that stuff in. This. If it's less than 10, in other words, the value is falsy, I'm going to fade it out. Okay? So this is a very basic example of me writing a custom animated data-bound thing. Right? So I'm not just limited. The reason why I'm showing you this is Knockout doesn't just limit you to binding what it knows about. It allows you to create your own understanding of what binding means. So you can bind to custom widgets, you can maybe write a jQuery plugin and then bind to the jQuery plugin. Right? You can begin to specify the logic that will be driven by the observables. You guys? Joe. Which step? Okay, next. Եթե observable-ի անունն եք ընդհանրապես տալիս, այս հեյքը։ Ումիջայլոց եթե edit եք անում, որը որ սա edit է, կանչելով հեյք չի, որտեղ կանչելուց մենակ արժեքն է վերադասնում ու գրելու ժամանակ ինքը չի կարող արժեքին գրի, չէ՞, ինքը իրան observable-ն է պետք որպեսզի observable-ի մեջ գրի։ Ճիշտ է։ Դա համար սա պետք է վերադասնի միայն observable-ը, հենց value-ն observable-ն է, չէ՞, արժեքը չի։ Ու ինքը տակից սա թե կկարդա ու կգրի։ Step, որպեսզի մենք այս ինչ է, այս value, what?
Expression.
Computed observable. We basically defined a nested an inline computed observable. Computed observable-ի ժամանակ, որպեսզի ես ստուգի եմ 10-ի շատ է շատ է, ես պետք է արժեք գտնեմ։ Եթե value-ն չկանչեի, ես կհամեմատեի ֆունկցիան, observable ֆունկցիան, ավելի մեծ է, քան 10-ը, որը որ 10, չէ՞։ Եթե կանչում եմ ստանում եմ արժեքը, ու արժեքն եմ համեմատում 10-ը։ Արժեք։ Ջան։ Ինչ է։ Դա մեծ օբյեկտ է։ Այսինքն
custom show որ մենք ավելին։
այս
Binding and left-handing։
այս ամեն ինչը։
Իսկ իրա մեջ մենք կարող override անենք locality function-ը։
Չէ, իրա մեջ չէ, նայեք, սա ընդհանրապես դառնում է, որ ինքը ձեզ տալիս է element ու observable, ու ասում է իրար ստերից կարդալու ու ինչ-որ effect տանը ստեր, կամ ստերից ուշադրություն դարձնելու, եթե գրում է հետ գրել ստեր, այդ algorithm-ը ձեր վրա։ Դա ուզում եք override անել։ Մի քիչ դժվար է, որտեղ շատերը closure-ի մեջ են, այսինքն ինչ-որ KO-ին կպած է, ու կարող եք տեսնեք, էլի, debugger-ի մեջ կարող եք KO-ի object-ին կպած բաները տեսնեք։ Այդ հա, այդ կարող է, բայց ինչ-որ closure-ի մեջ է, որտեղ սա knockout-ը ֆունկցիայի մեջ է, այդ, չէ, միակ վարիանտը հենց մտնել knockout-ի մեջ ու hack անել, այսպես է։ Ուրիշ հասեր կան։ Կան, okay, դե շարունակեցինք առաջ։ Okay, so AngularJS is going to be the third and final thing that we will talk about. Now, Angular is a framework, not a library. You will notice that Knockout was actually a library and not a framework. The difference between the two, by the way, is actually pretty simple. With a library, you control the code. Okay? You have some logic that is running through the application, right? The main application logic. And then at some point, when you are ready, you call into the library to perform some task for you. And then it returns, and then you continue. Right? So with Knockout, it's obvious, right? You write your code, you set up your models, you do whatever you need to do, and then you call KO apply binding into Knockout, which will bind to the DOM, returns, and then you continue your logic. With a framework like Angular, it's the exact opposite. Angular tells you where to put your code, and then Angular will control the overall flow of the application, and then will call into your code when it decides. Okay? So with a framework, you give up a level of control, right? Which has its downsides and its advantages, right? The advantage being, of course, you don't have to worry about managing the entire application. It gives you a lot of this logic right off the bat. So it makes it very quick and easy to build applications. You can do it very quickly and efficiently. The downside to this is, again, you are giving up control. And because you are giving up control, there may be things that Angular does or an approach that Angular might take that you might not agree with or like. In which case you get into a situation where you're what's commonly referred to as fighting with the framework. The framework does it one way, but you want it to do it another way, and now what do you do? Do you hack the framework? Do you go on forums and tell the guys that are working on Angular to change their algorithm? Or then it gets a little messy. Right? And this is a problem with any framework. Right? Anytime you submit to a framework that will control your application, you are giving up a level of control. So you really have to understand how the framework works, what the framework gives you to understand, is it worth it? Is it doing what you want it to do? And if it's not, don't use it. Okay, so Angular, it's MIT licensed, just like most of the other libraries we've seen, so it's a very friendly license. Use it as you like. And so Angular gives you lots of things, lots of functionality. And one of the pieces of functionality it gives you is declarative data binding. So declarative data binding is what we've seen in Knockout, where instead of writing code to connect your data to your view, in other words, your HTML, in other words, literally selecting, using jQuery to select an element, and then reading from here and writing to there, and having an event handlers and all that, you just put up markup, some attributes in the HTML, and this magic genie comes, reads all these things, and automatically puts the data in. Okay, that is declarative data binding. Right? So you declare the data, you declare what you want to go into your HTML rather than actually code it. What do we mean by this? So again, if you wanted to do something with jQuery, like where I modify something here and it updates here, what you would generally do is you would maybe select the input, right? You would maybe, I selected the input twice. Let's just do input, there you go. And then whenever input changes, we're going to call this update label. And we're also going to call update label again, but only after we assign an initial value of Armenia. So now, whenever this value changes, that will call the onChange event, right? Notice we did onChange. So whenever the input changes, it will call this function, which is here. And what the function will do is it will read the value from input and put it into H2. Clear, no problem. Now, the thing is, suppose in addition to keeping H2 and the input in sync, you want to keep H2, input, and a span, and a div, and an H3 all in sync. What you would have to do is you would have to add selectors for all those things, right? So suddenly you end up with book. Now suppose in addition to being able to edit the text here, you want to also have a form over here that can edit it. Now you have to keep this in sync with that, this, and all those other ones. But also keep that in sync with this and that and the other ones. And very soon you begin to end up with all of these dependencies of, if I change something here, I have to update it here. If I add one more thing, I have to now add all of those dependencies to that one and make sure that all of these know about this one to keep this and this in sync. A little crazy. And very quickly you get into a logical flow that ends up A, introducing lots of code, and B, ends up being very complicated. Two things that we need to stay away from. Okay, two things that I always urge you guys to do is write simpler code. In fact, there's going to be a whole talk on writing clean, simple code. And it's all about writing code that is easy to understand. And the easiest code to understand, by the way, is the smallest code. So the smaller, simpler code is easier to understand than big, complicated code. I think that's obvious, right? So clearly, this approach does not scale. Right? We can do this for a small, 2 controls, but the moment you have lots of controls with interactions in between them, this can easily get out of hand. Okay. So what does Angular propose? Well, with Angular, Angular proposes that you simply, rather than writing the code to connect those pieces, you simply mark the elements in your HTML with expressions that say what you want. In this case, it's very simple. You're saying, by the way, the data dash is a prefix that is sort of introduced in HTML5. And the notion of this is if you want to make up non-standard attributes, so attributes that are not part of the standard HTML, they suggest that you prefix it with data dash. So that your IDE, your development environment won't put a red thing underneath saying this is not a known attribute, what are you doing? It's easier to read because if you see this, you know that this is a custom thing. It's not like this, which is part of HTML. That kind of thing. Okay, so that's all that data dash. Okay, so the main part that we need to focus on is this. What is NG? Angular, right? So it's the namespace for Angular. Okay, so we do Angular model. Model is what you use when you want to read and write. Okay, so when you want bidirectional, you want to be able to write to it and read from it. That's model. You also have data-ng Angular bind. Bind means you can only read, but you cannot write. Okay, so model, read, write, bind, read. We got this? Cool. So what is this saying? This is saying whatever the value of your name is, I'm going to read from it, but also write to it. This is just going to read from it. Now initially, at the very beginning, there is no value in this made-up thing I called your name. There is no your name. It doesn't exist. But the moment I start modifying input, the moment I start editing input, it writes to your name. Because it wrote to your name, and this is reading from your name, as I change things here, it will update things here. Now, to show you that input not only writes but also reads, let me make multiple instances of input. Okay. So now we have a bunch of inputs, and if I change it in one, right? So I'm writing here, but reading here, here, here, and here. If I were to edit it, I don't know, here. Now I'm writing here, but reading here, here, here, and here. Okay? So these do read and write. This just does read. Questions so far? No. Very good.
Միակ հարց կար։
Անշուշտ։
Այդ ինպուտներից մեկը տալի է, նենց անե, որ ինքը մենակ ռիդանի։
Որ ինքը մենակ ռիդանի, չեմ փորձել, եկեք փորձենք։ Երբեք չեմ փորձել։ Չէ, բայց կարելի է ասենց, եթե ուզում եք read-only անեք, հենց element-ը իրան read-only դարձրեք, ու այդ ժամանակ element-ը ինքը read-only գտնի։ Ես կարծեմ փորձ։ Immediately, and also you can't make an H2 an NG model, because that also doesn't make sense, right? Because an H2 has no facility to edit, so that won't work either. So whenever you're doing edit controls, like inputs, text area, things like that, then you use NG model. Whenever you're using elements that are read-only, like div, span, H2, things like that, label, then you use ng bind. Okay, that's kind of the difference. Great question. Anything else? Okay. So if you notice, by the way, the code for this is, there is no code. It's just, I just happen to include Angular. Now there is one more small thing that I forgot to mention, and that's this up here. Data ng app. What is data ng app? So by default, what happens is, when you load AngularJS, so this is code that you're loading, right? When it loads, it queries the DOM, looking for an element that has in it ng app. If it finds it, it immediately bootstraps itself. In other words, sort of begins its process of parsing and binding. So just by putting this here, the moment this loads, it wakes up and says, AGFka, so that's how all of this magic happens, right? I didn't write any code, there's no code here, right? It's just HTML, no script. But just by loading this and putting that there, and the appropriate attributes in my DOM, this ran through the parser and performed the bind. Any questions so far? John? ng app beats mikani az. Yes. Yerpek does want to That's okay, close. Give me application. That's not okay. John. ng app ասենք վերագրենք ինչ-որ մի անուն, ու այդ ըստ այդ անունի բանանենք։ Չգիտեմ, լավ, սենց ասեմ, մինչև խորանալ ես ng app-ի մեջ, այս ng app-ը հիմնականում դեմոյի համար շատ հարմար է, որովհետև սենց շատ հեշտ է, ցույց են տալիս, որ կոդ պետք չի գրել եւ այլն, բայց իրականում հենց սկսենք օգտագործել Angular-ը, դուք կտեսնեք, որ ng app-ը հարաբերս չենք օգտագործում, որովհետև եթե ng app-ով անենք, չէ, Angular-ը հենց load է արվում, անմիջապես query-անում աշխատացնում է, բայց իրականում մենք Angular-ին, երբ որ load արվում Angular-ը, պետք է ինչ-որ initialization անենք, controller-ն եք ավելացնենք, directive եւ այլն, նոր ասենք, այ հիմա աշխատի։ Դա համար այս իրականում գրեթե երբեք չի օգտագործվում, դրա համար չեմ ուզում, էլի շատ խորհրդանշան է։ Այս ընդհանրապես ցույց եմ տալիս, որ հասկանաք այս ոնց է եղավ։ Տենց եղավ։ Okay։ I see what's nice. So, in this example, there is no ng app, right? So there are a few differences in this example from the previous. So, functionally, it's going to work pretty much the same way, right? I modify a text box and it updates an h2. So functionally, it's the same demo, right? But you see that the code is a little different. So in this case, there's no ng app. There's just an ID that references some name, let's say main. The input is the same, ng model, y model, read write, exactly. So I can read and write to this, and again, because I'm in a read write element, right? The input is an editable element. Give it data, you can read data. But here, look, I've changed the syntax for H2. This is a slightly different syntax. If you remember in the previous one, we had an attribute called ng bind. Remember that? I'll show it. Remember this? So the result of this is the same thing as the result of that. The result is the same. The syntax is different. Now, a quick thing that you might think of is, well, why have the two syntaxes? Why don't we just always use this and not bother with that weird ng bind, right? The reason for this is actually the following. That when your page first loads, you know how you usually put your scripts at the bottom? Why do you put your scripts at the bottom? That's right, so you can see the page rather than just a blank screen. And then when your script loads, it will come in and fill everything in, right? So let me ask you a question. If we're waiting for Angular to load, what is the user seeing? This crap. Right? The user will see this weird, strange markup stuff. Now there are ways around this. You could, for example, start it off with a class that keeps all of this hidden. And then when your code loads and binds everything, then you flip the class and everything animates in. Maybe initially you just have a loader, right, which is loading. And then when your code loads, it hides the loader and animates in, for example, the content. You can do that. But just be careful in the situations where you don't do that, because the user might see this flash before they actually see the real data. So just one reason why you might want to use ng bind rather than this syntax is because ng bind is an attribute in the element which the user will never see. But this, they might see. You guys get that? I'll take down this. Open this button. Sure. Okay, good. So there's one more piece of information here. There is no ng app, right? So when Angular loads, it goes ng app, right? So it does nothing. So now what we need to do is explicitly tell Angular, do something. And specifically do something with this element. How do we tell it? We do Angular, which is in our global namespace. So if you remember, typically, if you don't use A and D or anything interesting, the way libraries contribute themselves to everything else is through the global namespace. Right? So jQuery will add jQuery $1 to window. Angular adds the word Angular to window. YUI adds YUI to the window. Dojo adds Dojo to the window. You get the idea. So, we have access to Angular because it's global. We do Angular dot, here's the part, bootstrap. Bootstrap means anti-gotzi, right? Beginning. Bootstrap, and we give it the element to start with. So it can either magically find ng app, or we can explicitly give it an element. Right? This is the syntax we will usually use. Why? Because this allows us to, before calling this, right here, above that, initialize a whole bunch of stuff before we call Angular. And you will see that most of what we will do today is learn about how to initialize Angular. How to add controllers and directives and all these weird things that we'll discuss in a bit. Questions about this? Is this clear how this works? This one. You can, okay. Angular իրանմեջ ունի զյադար կոչվում է jQlite. jQuery ոնց որ թեթև վարը։ Այս ինչ է։ Ինքը իրանմեջ, որտեղ իրանք օգտագործում են, բայց ուրեմն Angular Google-ի ինժեներները գրել, յատուս տղա է միջալը, միշկա չհիշում։ Ու բանը, երբ որ Google-ը ներքում, երբ որ օգտագործում է jQuery, իրանք jQuery չեն օգտագործում, որտեղ jQuery մեջ կար 1000 մի բան, չէ։ Դրա համար իրանք այդ jQuery-ին վերցրել են, ու պահել են մենակ այն ամենայն ոսկորները, հա, այսպես ասած, այն ամենակարևոր մասը, մնացածը ախնեց է։ Ու Angular-ը իր մեջ ունի jQlite։ Դա համար ինքը, բայց եթե jQuery include ես անում, ինքը չի ջարդում իրան, ինքը ընդհանրապես սկսում է okay աշխատում է, էլի։ Բայց ուզում եմ ասել ինքը այս jQuery object-ի API-ը հասկանում, դրա համար կարելի է իրան իրականում։ Okay, պատասխանեցի։ Գլոբալի գլոբալ։ Չէ, okay, sorry. I automatically, in this demo application, inject jQuery. So no, in reality, no. Yes, you would have to include like another script tag for jQuery. jQlite to global spacing չեմ կարծում։
Իսկ ում տալիս է։
Հա, չէ, հարցն անում է թե եթե jQuery include չանեք, չնայած Angular-ի մեջ կա jQlite։ Չէ, ասում է global դոլար կլինի այդ ժամանակ։
Ինչքան հիշում եմ, հա։
Ինչքան հիշում եք, հա։ Ես կասեի չէ։ Չէ, ես կասեի չէ։ Եկե, լավ, հետո ուղղակի հետազոտությունը հետո կանենք խոսենք դրա մասին։ Բայց ես ենթադրում եմ չէ, տարօրինակ կլինի, որ դուք include անեք Angular-ը ու ոչ մի ուրիշ բան, եկե անկապ տեղը մեկ էլ դոլար հայտնվի global namespace-ում։ Դա ինչ-որ տրամաբանական չէ, ես կարծում։ Լավ, anyways, այս մասի համար հարցեր կան։ Հա? Հա, okay, ես խաղ, բայց հավանական չի, բայց մեկ անում։ Ահա։ Այս հետարքի է, բայց գլոբալ ամեցում։ Հետո ինքը լոկալ կարող էր մտցնել իր մեջ ու պահեր, չէ, իր բանի մեջ, իր ֆունկցիայի մեջ։ Հետարքին է ինչ է գլոբալ մտցում։ Լավ, okay, չէ, անում է, բայց ուղղակի ես չէի ան։ Okay, this one is.
Որպես your main bond
Հա, չէ, ես ավելի շատ ցույց եմ տալիս, որպեսզի ծանոթանաք այդ syntax-ը։ Թե կօգտագործեք թե չէ, դա ձեր գործն է։ Բայց այն եմ ասում, սա խնդիր չի լինի, եթե դուք օրինակ load-ի ժամանակ սա փակ է, որ չերևա։ Loader-ը ինչ որ ցույց տա, հետո bind անեք նոր ցույց տա։ Այդ էլ է տարբերակը։ Ուրիշ հարցեր կան։ Չկա։ Okay։ Okay, so let's get into it. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to, for now, go back to just using ng app. For now, and then we'll go back to using the bootstrap method, and you'll see why. So what are we doing? We have this ng app, so when Angular wakes up, it goes, not ng app. That's fine. And it begins doing its work. So it does top-down, of course, right? So it comes here and it says, it finds this new attribute. We've never seen this before. ng controller. ng controller. What is ng controller? Well, ng controller is basically a function. Okay, so in this case, my controller is this function. This function, typically, a controller, typically takes what is known as a $scope. $scope is a scope. Literally the way you think of programming as having scope, like your variables have scope, right? This is what that is. This is scope. So what this is saying is this code right here needs to run in this scope. With me? Now, whenever you're in a scope, you have variables that work in that scope, right? That's what scope is. It's a variable can work within this block, right? Okay. So here, if whatever I attach to $scope, so in this case, I'm attaching name to $scope, right? So what that means is in here, I can reference name. Why? Because this block is running in that scope. If I were to reference ng model name here, I would be running in the root scope or the global scope, which doesn't have a value for name. And so if I were to bind to name here, I would get nothing. But here, it's reading this name, which has a value of Joe. Let me show you. So this we get, right? It's reading from name, which is this name here, which has the value of Joe. And it's also writing, right? It's read-write because it's a model. Here, it's just reading. So I change something here, and it changes it there. This we get. If I do name here, name, notice we don't see a third value. There is no third value. Again, the reason for this is because this is running in the global scope. This is running in the local scope, which we've defined here. So name here has a value of Joe, but here has a value of nothing. There is no name in the global scope. Joe. Եթե ընդհանրապես հանենք սա, աշխատի, բայց այդ ժամանակ այս name-ը կլինի global scope-ի name-ը։ Իսկ global scope-ում name-ը արժեք չունի, մինչև ես չգրեմ իր մեջ։ Նայեք, եթե սա հանենք, հիմա արժեք չունի, բայց հիմա որ փոխեմ, նայեք երկու անգամ եմ ասում։ Ինչի, էլի եմ, էսա, և սա է։ Այս ժամանակ արդեն name-ը ես գրում եմ global scope-ի մեջ։ Հասկանում եք, բայց այս scope-ի հետ ոչ մի գործ չունեմ, այս scope-ը չեմ փոխում։ Լսում եք։ Որտեղ արժեք չունի, undefined։ Undefined-ը չի տպում որպես undefined, տպում է որպես ոչ մի բան։ Նայեք, եթե global scope-ի մեջ ես դնեմ մի հատ input, նայեք։ Ինչ կլինի այդ input box-ի մեջ։ Դա, ինչի դա դեր։ Որտեղ name-ը առաջինը ընդհանրապես չկա, բայց եթե լինել է, մեջը բան չկա։ Իրականում չկա, ուղղակի չկա։ Բայց հենց ես սկսում եմ գրել, ինքը ստեղծում է name-ին ու կպցնում է global scope, այն scope-ին, որի մեջ ինքը կա, այս բանի global scope-ն է, ու սկսում է լցնել իր մեջ արժեքը։ Ու քանի որ սա եւ սա խախտում են նույն արժեքի, նույն scope-ի մեջ, բնականաբար երկուսը sync-ի մեջ են։ Okay։ Ու ինչ։ Ուրիշ ալ։ Name meg. Օրինակ։ Թե ինքը գնում է ուզում ես ասես սպասի։ Եթե ճիշտ եմ հիշում սա, մի րոպե։ Scope dot. Դա է շացը։ Okay, այս մենք չենք անցել դա, դրա համար մի քիչ տարօրինակ է, բայց այս root կամ global scope-ն է։ Root-ը դա սկիզբն է, հա։ Ու ամեն անգամ մենք controller-ը դնում ենք, մենք դնում ենք դրա տակը։ Հիմա ձեր հարցը այն է, որ եթե
մենք scope-ում չենք հայտարարում,
գնում է վերև։ Ոչ միայն մորով, ցանկացած բանում, երբ որ scope-երը կա մեխանիզմ, որ անջատեք դա, որի մասին հետո կխոսանք, բայց by default inheritance կա։ Այսինքն նույն օրենքը, որը գտնվում է JavaScript-ի մեջ, որ եթե local scope-ի մեջ չկա, գնա մի հատ վերև, այդ նույն օրենքը իրականում աշխատում է step։ Բայց մի բան ցույց տամ։ Եկեք ուրեմն սա արեցի name make-ը, չէ՞, եկեք տեսնենք name make-ը։ Պետք է լինի Սա պարզ է, ստեղ փոխում եմ այդ name make-ը, ամենտեղ փոխվում է, բայց ստեղ եթե փոխեմ, նայեք ստեղ չի փոխվում։ Բայց հասկանում եք ինչի, որտեղ որ գրում եմ, ես գրում եմ local scope-ի մեջ, բայց որ կարդում եմ, գրում եմ վերև։ Ով որ չհասկացան այդ պահը, ընթացքում կանցնեք դիմաց։ Բայց ուրիշ հարցեր կան։ Okay. So, this is very similar to the previous example. So we have an ng app which tells Angular where to begin. We define our controller, my control, which is this, right? Which will take a $scope and add things to it, in this case name. And now, because this code here runs in this scope, we have access to name, which is Joe. Հասկանում եք, ինչ է կատարում։ Այս scope-ը իր մեջ ունի ինչ-որ արժեքներ։ Որպեսզի այդ արժեքները հասանելի լինեն, ես պետք է կոնկրետ ասեմ այս մասը կոդի, թող աշխատի այդ scope-ի մեջ։ Now, in addition to being able to add this, I can also add programmatically a listener to scope. Remember in Knockout, we did this thing where we did observable.subscribe, and whenever the observable changed, we got the event. This is the same thing in Angular. So in Angular, you can do $scope, $watch, now you try to do some dots. Listen, watch. And then you specify the attribute that you want to listen to. In this case, we want to listen to name. And then you define a function which will get called whenever name changes. And so whenever it changes, we will print new value is, and then the new value of name. And so what we get is, as I change this, exactly. So you can programmatically, in your code, listen to changes in attributes in your scope. Listen to this.
Can you take the code the around?
We can boss it. Sense?
So to jest him value callback
Other questions? Oh, es ջրում ջնջել։ Oh, դուք ինչ եք ապրում, ինչ կդի։ Ուրիշ հարցակա։ Good. Okay. Okay, so we looked at, remember in Knockout we looked at for each in order to iterate over a list of values. Remember that? So we have a similar thing here, but the syntax is different, but the idea is the same. By the way, this is the thing that I want to keep coming back to. And this is why I wanted to do this survey of libraries or frameworks, is because the same type of thing is repeated in all of them. They just have slightly different approaches. They have different optimizations, but the concepts are exactly the same. Okay, so in this case, instead of for each, we do ng repeat. Repeat. So we want to repeat this block, this entire block, inclusively. That's one nuance that is different from knockout. Knockout says for each, and it says repeat the stuff inside. This says ng repeat for the entire block. So this entire list item will get repeated for each item that is inside of legs. Okay? So again, we're going to repeat this, all of this, for every lang inside of langs. Okay. So what is langs? Langs, you see here, is this thing that I'm attaching to $scope, which has a value of an array. It has an array inside, and that array includes two objects. One that includes text referencing Java, and one that includes text referencing C#. We forgot one of the really cool languages, of course. Let me add that. JavaScript. Okay. So we get that. Okay. So for each language, each lang inside of this array, it will iterate over and repeat that whole block and render inside lang.text. Ooh, that's interesting. Dot. You can do paths in your expressions, right? You don't just have to specify name. You can say foo.bar.zoo.name. And that will work. Okay? So in this case, why do we do .text? Because we're repeating for each object, right? And then within that object, we are assigning it to lang. And then from that lang, we're getting this text in order to print Java for the first, C# JavaScript. By the way, this syntax, if you guys remember, in JavaScript, remember how do you iterate over attributes of an object? For var key in obj. Remember this syntax? Yeah? You see it? This is the same idea as this. You are iterating, you are giving some name for the iteration of everything that is in here. The difference, though, is that this is just a key name, whereas in here, lang represents the actual value. That's the difference. Okay? Questions on this iteration? No question. John.
You said that there are slight difference, right?
There what?
Slight difference between this and for each. Knockout.
Yes.
But
Yes.
what's the difference? I don't get the difference.
I'll show you. I will show you, my good friend. Okay, this one. How about this one? So in here, if you do for each, right, what is it going to repeat? It's going to repeat that. Right? In Angular, it's inclusive. It's going to repeat that. You see the difference? Itself. 아니다, inclusive. 이란 include는 공간이 context image. 아니다, that's. 우리 샤츠, John. Երբեք չեմ փորձել, բայց չեմ պատկերացնում երբ դա կունենայի։ Երևի դրանով չեմ փորձել։ Բայց կարող ենք փորձենք, լավ, okay։ Հասցեցիք, անեմ, աշ չկա։ Okay, ունենք մի հատ object, շուտ մի հատ դատամ, որը որ ունի իր մեջ, չգիտեմ։ Okay, լավ, ու մեկ, չէ։ Մենք iterate ենք անում foo-ով։ Ես ենթադրում եմ, որ սա երևի չի աշխատի, բայց ամենայն դեպս եկեք փորձենք։ Այստեղ lang.a
Foo-ով չէ, lungs-ով էլի։
Չէ, չէ։ just like us. Sorry. Banks. Okay. Dakum yere link waki cho ito right now. I waki chigiran website. Okay, got. Or AdSense got. Uri shot. Chika. Okay. So you have this data that I keep saying you're going to have in your scope to then bind to and draw on the screen. The question is, where does that data come from, and how can you, after you modify that data, send it back to the server from which it came? Right? So typically, this is what you would do, right? You would have, here's my client, there's my server. I would request some JSON, convert the JSON into an actual object, stick it to my scope, bind to the user interface. The user interface can modify that object, and then I can take that object, serialize it back into JSON, and ship it back to the server. You guys kind of imagine the end-to-end cycle now? I read JSON from the server, convert it into an object, stick it to my scope, and bind it. Modify it, read from my scope, convert to JSON, send it back to the server. Okay? That is the life cycle. So let's see how that can be done. So in this example, I didn't actually want to implement a server. So to keep things simple, I'm going to write some local code to pretend like it's the server. And instead of a real database, I'm just going to use local storage. For those of you who don't know this, local storage is basically a local cache where you can put your information in the browser. There's session storage, which every time you refresh your page, you lose all the previous information. And then there's local storage, which will remember all of the data that your website put into it. So even if you refresh the browser, it can still read that data. Unless the user clears it, or if the size gets so big that it begins to, whatever. Local storage, local storage is IE Meschian. That's right. Gaza nodes na avani shata, but hima avani metza. Gaza avani metza. Okay, so you can put more stuff in it. And as the browsers progress, they give you more and more space. I think that's the main difference. If I'm wrong, let me know. But that's yes, that's it. Okay, so we have this magic server, and what does this magic server do? Well, we're going to call it to get some data. Now, to get data, it's going to do our server DB, our local storage, .get item. And we're going to give it some key, right? And then after a set timeout, why am I putting a set timeout? Just to pretend like we went to a server and came back, right? Because usually when you make a request, an HTTP request to the server, there's a delay, right? There's some time that you spend waiting for it to come back. So I put an artificial set timeout, and then I call back the function that is given to me with the data I read. Okay, fair enough. So I read the data here and return it. And then here, if I want to save the data, what I do is I give it data in the callback, and then it does set item for that data. And then after some timeout, after 100 milliseconds, it then calls my callback. Okay? This is my artificial client server. It's not a real server, but you get the idea, right? It stores data and it retrieves data. That's it. Okay? Okay, so now that you get that part, I did one more thing, which is I modified jQuery. I modified jQuery's getJSON to, instead of actually doing what it's supposed to do, which is make an HTTP GET or POST or whatever, well, GET actually, HTTP GET, I modified it to instead call my local server. Okay? If you didn't quite get that part, it's okay. Just understand that in my logic, I'm going to call the server to get information, and I'm going to call the server to save information. Everything I mentioned so far is just implementation detail, which you can, if you don't get it, don't worry. All right, I also overrode post so that I can save the data to my local server. Okay. Okay. So I have my controller. So we've seen this. We know what that is. It's a controller that takes a $scope. And whatever we attach to $scope, we know we can access as long as in our DOM, in our HTML, we've defined ng-controller to reference that. So what am I attaching? Well, this time I'm not attaching data, I'm attaching functions. Sorry, functions are data. I'm attaching data, in this case functions. Remember, right? Functions are data because functions are objects. Right? Functions, data. So here I'm attaching load, which references that function, and save, which is referencing that function. Okay? So for load, what are we doing? When load is called, we will call jQuery, our modified version of jQuery, to go and get some random data, and the data will come here. When it comes here, we will store that data in our $scope, but we need some attribute to reference that object. So I made up an attribute and called it value. Okay? So from our scope, we'll have a value reference to the data that we got back from the server. Okay? Let's forget about that for a moment. This does not exist yet. Okay, and then we have a save, which will do the opposite. It will do a post. It will do angular.toJSON. I'll say why angular.toJSON in a moment. And then you give it $scope.value. Again, the stuff that is referencing the data that we got back from the server. Why? Because the assumption is that in between, we've modified that data. And now we're sending the modified data, or we're posting it back to the server. Okay? All right. So let's try this. So I, make some changes, and I hit save, and then if I go to my local, forget all those errors that you're seeing. If I go to resources, here we go. Then I go to local storage. I go to that.
The first.
Arachina, here we go. And here we see all of that stuff. We see first name, blah, blah, blah, last name, blah, blah, blah. Right? So I've sent it to the server, and this is my database. So you can imagine this would be like MongoDB or MySQL or something like that. That is storing the data I sent. Okay, so now I want to read the data. I want to load that data. Right? So let me refresh the browser to clear everything. Okay, so now there's nothing there. And now if I hit load, what happened? Well, what happened was that I made a request to my server, which read the data from the database, sent it back. I put it into my $scope as a value. Forget that. And then that magically updated my data binding, which is relative to this controller, and in here I'm doing value.firstName. See? Value.lastName. You guys see it? Okay. Now why did I say don't worry about $apply? Let's remove $apply. Let's get rid of this. And now let's hit load. Right? What happened? Nothing. Did that function not call itself? Let's see. I thought it did. Let's do in here alert risk. And now let's hit load. It's coming back. So we get the data from the server, but Angular isn't actually doing anything about it. Why? In order to understand this, you have to understand how Angular works. Okay? So I mentioned to you guys before that if you modify a JavaScript object, in the current implementations of browsers, there is no way for you to register an event listener. So if someone comes and just modifies your object, you can't listen to say, when that happens, tell me. There is no functionality that will do that. How does Backbone solve this? It solves this by wrapping the entire object in a model and forcing you to make all modifications through that model using the get and set. Because you do it through the model knows that you did it and can raise the appropriate events. Right? Okay, How does knockout solve this problem? Knockout forces you to wrap each individual value with an observable, right? And all changes have to go through this observable so that it knows that it changed and raised the appropriate event. Okay? Now if you notice, we're just attaching data, just basic JavaScript objects to $scope. So how does $scope, or how does Angular know when that data changes? We have no observables. We're not wrapping our objects in any way. How can Angular know? Here's how. When Angular calls you, in other words, my control is a function, right? So when my control is called, Angular calls it, right? By the way, remember when I said that the difference between a library and a framework is that the framework calls your code when it decides? This is what I meant. We have no control. We just specify information inside the controller, and then Angular calls us when it decides, right? So very much a framework. Okay. So when Angular calls you with a $scope, and then this function returns, what Angular will do is it will look at what you have in $scope and how it has changed. Here's the key, how it changed since the time it gave it. So it does a diff. It does a comparison. It literally will walk the tree, will walk this object, and see what was modified. And when it finds it, it will go and update the appropriate bindings. Right? Is that part clear? Okay. So Angular has an algorithm which is encapsulated in a function called digest, marse. 그러니까 마rsuma, այսինքն default-ը որոշումը ինչա կատարվում, ու ըստ դրա որոշումը ինչա փոխվել եւ ինչ որ դրաքսատած. Okay. So if Angular calls you, it knows because it called you that it has to do a diff. Okay. But if you yourself quietly go and modify $scope, Angular doesn't know that you modified $scope, right? So how does it know to run digest? It doesn't, which is what's happening here. So the way you tell Angular, Angular jump, okay? That's this. Okay? So here what we're saying is, even though, remember there's a timeout and so on, so this has returned long before this has run. So after we modify something, we say Angular jump, apply, run your algorithms, run your digestion, run your whatever. Just understand that I just did something. You might want to look at it. Okay? That's what $apply will do. So now this time if I hit load, notice it loaded, it worked. Okay? And then I can modify this further, it's safe. By the way, these buttons, how does that work? These are functions, right? So we have this thing called, so for the form, I'm binding to ng submit. Ng submit. Now, you might say, well, why don't you bind to, like, why a form? Why did I put this stuff in the form? Why didn't I just put it into, I don't know, just a div with some text boxes inside? Can anyone tell me the advantage of using a form in a user interface like this? Validation. That's one. What else?
You can press enter at some point.
Yeah, that's actually one of the common ones, is you can hit enter in a text box and that will automatically submit the form. In an input, not a text area. A text area, it will go to the next line. In an input, it will submit the form. Okay? And people generally are used to this kind of behavior, right? And because they're used to this kind of behavior, you would either have to implement it yourself if you put it into a div, or you can just use a form and get all of that for free, plus the HTML5 validation, right? Which is great. Okay, so what we're saying is when this form is submitted, do that. What is that? You're calling the function save. Where is save coming from? It's coming from this controller's context, right? Cool, no problem. There's also load. Again, it's just a button, and when you do ng click, now notice we're learning a few additional attributes now. So we know ng model, read write. Ng bind, read. Ng click, when you want to get click events. Ng submit, when you want to know when a form has submitted. Did we study anything else? I think that's it. Oh, yeah, and ng app, if you want to do magic, but don't do magic. Okay, so when you click, it's going to call load. And again, load is the function that will make the AJAX call to get the data from the server, add it to scope, and then tell Angular jump on up. Angular will then do its digestion, run its diffing algorithm, and then update the user interface. That's load. That's it. Oh, one quick question. One comment. Notice we're doing Angular to JSON. We're not doing JSON.stringify. There's a reason for this. In order to make this diffing algorithm performant, in other words, really fast, Angular decorates the object, potentially, with additional attributes, usually prefixed by the $sign. Okay? If you just do JSON.stringify, you might accidentally end up including that additional garbage in your result, which you don't want to do. What Angular to JSON will do is it will do what JSON stringify does, but it will remove to JSON stringify. Parse artırma, parse string its dağıtılma object, stringify object it dağıtılma string. JSON.stringify object dağıtılma text. Text որպեսի ուղարկենք բաց, JSON parser ինչ է։ Ընդունում է լեզու, չէ՞, որևէ ինչ-որ text, որը լեզու է, չէ՞։ Ու այդ լեզուն կարդում է, ստեղծում է parse tree, գիտեք, արդեն գիտեք, չէ՞։ Okay, ու դες վերադասնում է հետ JavaScript object. Okay, so parse reads it into an object, stringify converts it back into text. Stringify, string.string. So Angular.toJSON will take the value that is attached to scope and convert it into a string, but removes any additional decorations that Angular has added to it. So you get nice clean data to send to your server. Okay? Խնդիր չկա հակառակ բանով։ Այսինքն կարող է յուն utility համար լինի, չեմ նայ, ես միշտ JSON բանը փաստում եմ։ Ուղղակի այդ խնդիր չկա, որտեղ server-ը չի ուղղակի որ պետք է ինքը strict բանի հասկանալ, չէ՞։
Ասի loading-ի համար։
Loading-ի համար։
Loading-ի չէ,
ինքը
loading-ի համար։ Monitor-ը ինչ է կարող
JSON bottom promise. Concrete Angular ունի հասկացա։ Ուղղակի բանը ասում չգիտեմ concrete Angular դա ունի թե չէ, բայց որտեղ հիմնականում JSON-ն է օգտագործում, JSON get. Okay. Ուրիշ հարցեր։ Բայց շատ լավ։ Ուրիշ։ Չկա։ John. John, of course we can have a 10-minute break. I'll see you guys in 10. Oh, Bob, before you go. Խնդրեմ ովքինները գնացեք վերև կամ եկեք մեջները նստեք կամ ոնց արվում։ Այսօր որն էր, 8-րդ օրն էր, չէ՞, 8, զուսվակ, 8, Okay, երեքի վրա, 1, 2, 3, was, Rouben? Wer hat das?
Բան ռադիկալի կողմից լավ չի ունենա, դե մազանգուլյարներում կանտրոլերները արդեն չեն թողում սա 4-ով կանտրոլեր հայտարարել, դու մոդուլ ունենաս, մոդուլին կպցնես, սիրուն աստվում։ Իմացել ինչ է
Մատենա մեզ ասա կզանգեմ չեմ։
Mas continuando, por exemplo, essa parte da topological sort. We have tested որպեսի հաստատեն, որ ասած
Tremendous thing.
Okay, so just before we move forward, Gebro taught me something really cool. So I feel like I should share it with everybody. So remember here I mentioned $apply. So you call $apply on the scope, right? Apparently, there's another way to do this, and it's actually a cleaner way to do this. So what you could do is ask for this $timeout. I'll talk about how this stuff works and where this is coming from in just a bit. But for now, just assume just like you asked for $scope and you got it, you can also ask for $timeout and you can get that too. So $timeout works just like window.setTimeout. It has the similar syntax, right? So it will wait for a particular delay and then execute the function that you give it. So in this case, what we can do is we can put our modification into this $timeout. Why does this work? My assumption is this, that remember, whenever Angular calls your code, it knows that it called your code. Okay, obviously. And so when it returns from that function, it knows to pay attention to any changes that might have happened in the intro. Right? So when Angular calls your myController function, at the end it says, did $scope change? It pays attention to it. Right? In this case, you're sleeping a little bit, and then you're saying to Angular, execute this function after a certain timeout. Right? That's what setTimeout does, or timeout. Same thing. Digest, digest batiya. What the digest is different. You get a different. You can change one over. I think inside is yentarjuman. I did that. Yentarjuman, but get. Now like this level. Yentarjuman. What you can apagayu. Hiç kanıma çe. Inka ganchuma. But how do you go inka ganchuma? Inka is for return album. Stuguma. Bofera teche.
digest-ին հենց digest-ը լինում, կամ չունի, զրոյա digest-ը միանգամից կանչելի։ Եթե ասենք 5 վայրկյանը կարող է 5 անգամ digest լինի, բայց այն չի կանչի մինչև հաջորդ digest-ը այդ 5 վայրկյանի։
Բայց հայ digest algorithm-ի մեջ չի ցանկանում, հա, այդ ընթացքում։
Դե պրոստը digest-ից հետո ինքը փոփոխություններ արտահայտում, հետո թարգմանում է։
Այս ֆունկցիոնի սկզբից կանչի, որպես այդ փոփոխությունը լինի ու նոր շանի տիպի, չէ՞։ Այսինքն եթե նույնիսկ digest
Երբ որ digest-ի ընթացքում եք կանչում, դրա համար է դիպը չի լինում, բայց երբ որ digest-ից հետո կանչում եք, մի հատ է digest։
Այդ եմ ասում, մի հատ էլ պետք է։ Ահա, այդ համենը եմ ասում, այդ եմ ասում, որ այս ֆունկցիան, որ ինքը կանչում է, չէ՞, ինքն է կանչել ու գիտի, որ ինքը կանչել է։ Ինքը որ կանչում է, այս որ return-ը անում, ինքը ուշադրություն է դարձնում, scope-ի արժեքը փոխվել է, թե չէ։ Այդ եղավ քո երկրորդ digest-ը, որ Գևորգը նշեց։ Այդ երկրորդ digest-ի ժամանակ ինքը տեսնում է, value փոխվել է, թե չէ։ Ու պարզում է, որ հայերի փոխվել է։ Տեսա։ Ու ըստ դրան ինքը update անում ու նկարում է, ինչ որ պետք է նկարում։ Հատկացեցիք։ Մոտավորապես։ Okay. Alrighty, let's keep going. So this is the demo of the thing we're going to write. So it's a checklist. It's like a to-do list, okay? So you can, take these things, okay? You can add additional values like go to the car, yes, sleep, drink, eat. Okay? Then you can say this will get an integer. I get it. Right? So you get the idea. This is what we're going to build. So the question is, how do you build something like this? Well, how do you think the list is made? Yes, correct. And you repeat. You're repeating this thing for each value in your list. Okay? All right, fair enough. So let's see it. So we have ng app, so that we don't have to call bootstrap. And then what we have is we specify the to-dos controller. So that means all of this code here, all that, okay, all of that will execute in the context of that. Right? That's what a scope, that's when you define a controller, you're saying everything underneath it will execute in the scope that is defined in that controller. In other words, inside of that. And so what does that have? Well, it has an array which has two objects. One object says text, learn Angular, and then there's a done attribute which is Boolean. It either has a true value or a false value. Right? Okay, and then we have a few functions. This one is the equivalent of a computed observable. You guys remember that? Okay, so it's a function that will return the result of a computation. And what is the computation? What is this doing? Someone tell me. It's looping over every item in the to-do and checking to see if the done attribute is true or false. If it's true, it's incrementing a counter and then returning that counter. So it's returning to you the number of items in your to-do that are done, that have finished, that have a checkbox. Okay? So that's what this function does. Okay? What does that function do? It's an add function which takes as an argument a new item object. And that new item object has attached to it text. And so what we do is, if we want to add another value to this array, how do you add something to an array? Push. Right. So you do scope, to-dos, to reference that array, dot push, and then an object that you want to push. The object will have text of whatever was given to it. And then done, we're defaulting to false. The assumption here is if you make a new task, you probably haven't done it yet. So you default it to false. And so every time add is called, it will push another object into our array with the given text. Okay? So let's look at this a bit closer. So in here we have to-dos, where look at this expression here. This is calling the function num done. Do you remember what num done does? It computes the number of items that are done. So this will give you the number of items that you have finished, that are checked, slash to-dos. What is to-dos? An array, which has a dot length, right? So to-dos dot length will give you the total number of items in your list, right? So if we come back here, this is the total number of items in the list. This is the number of items that are done. When I modify something, the num done gets re-executed, right? If I modify something, num done is re-executed. Okay, so to give you an idea, since stuff. Okay, $scoping.name tag. Joe. Okay. Եկեք ստեղ դնենք մի հատ input box. Ուզում եմ bind անել name-ին, ոնց եմ անում։
Model.
Ուզում եմ համակարգել համբերեմ։
Model.
Ուստեղ կարող եմ որպեսի հաստատեմ որ գրում է, դնեմ name։ Okay, հիմա եթե ստեղ փոխեմ, այնտեղ կարծում, չէ՞, այս բացը։ Հիմա name-ը experiment ենք անում, ժողով, նայեք։ Հիմա ես name-ը կփոխեմ, name-ը ոչ մի կապ չունի num done computed ֆունկցիայի հետ։ Ճիշտ է, ճիշտ եմ ասում։ Արի ես փոխենք, մի հատ console log դնենք այնտեղ, տեսնենք կանչում է թե չէ։ Okay։ We're checking it. Dirty check. Ezak ասում։ Console.log. Okay. Սկսում ենք երկու հատով, չէ՞։ Հիմա բազա, եթե սա փոխեմ, հասկանալի է ինչի է կանչում։ Իմիջիայից ինչի է երկու հատ չեմ հասկանում, բայց okay, լավ, ինչու է սա։ Տպեց, չէ՞։ Այդպես sense անել։ Okay, սկսում ենք երկու հատով ու փոխում ենք Joe։ Բայց հասկանալի է ինչ։ Սա կան ամեն ցանկացած բան, երբ որ scope-ում փոխվում է, նայեք, ինքը diff-ը արեց, չէ՞։ Ու ըստ diff-ի հասկացավ կոնկրետ ինչը փոխվեց։ Ինքը գիտի, որ եթե դու expression ունես, որ կարծում է կոնկրետ այդ attribute-ից, okay, ինքը գիտի, որ կոնկրետ սա պետք է փոխել, բայց սա պետք չի փոխել։ Հա՞։ Բայց եթե ֆունկցիա է, ինքը շատ գիտի ձեր ֆունկցիայի մեջ ինչ լոգիկա կա։ Եթե հիշում եք, նակյալը հատուկ պարտադրում է, որ իրաց ձեր computed observable-ից ուրիշ observable-ներ կանչեն, չէ՞։ Քանի որ observable-ներ կանչում եք, ու այդ observable-ները knockout-ինն են։ Հայերենով դժվար է, ժողովուրդ կներեք։ Okay, so knockout forces you in your computed observable to call other observables. Knockout owns those observables and so knows when you call them, right? And so it can begin a recording, call your function and see which observables are getting called by your function, and then create this dependency on that list. Okay? With Angular, there are no observables. Okay? There is no specific way of wrapping objects. You just have an object attached to a scope. And so in here, in our num done, in here, we can put any arbitrary function, any arbitrary code, any logic. It can read from scope, it can go to the server, it can do whatever it wants. It's just code. Because it's just code that does whatever it wants, there is no way for Angular to monitor what you've touched. Zapish չի կարող, որտեղ event-ներ չկան։ Okay? Քանի որ չի կարողանի, երբ որ ինքը կանչում է, ինքը չգիտի ինչ եք ձեռքվել։ Քանի որ ինքը չգիտի ինչ եք ձեռքվել, միակ վարիանտը, որ ինքը ճիշտ կարող է աշխատի, դա նա է, որ երբ որ scope-ը փոխվում է, նա նորից ֆունկցիան կանչի։ Պատկերացրեցիք։ Սա շատ կարևոր է հասկանալ Angular օգտագործելուց, որովհետև սրանով հասկանում եք ֆունկցիա computed observable-ը հավասարը, հա, computed observable-ին Angular-ի մեջ ինչքան թանկ հաճույք։ Ու դա հասկանալով պետք է սա շատ ուշադիր օգտագործել։ Ջան։
Եթե ինքը միայն դեպի կանչում է ու հասկանում է եթե դեպի բան փոխել է, դրանից հետո նույնիսկ մեծ կանչում է, որովհետեւ հասկանում է չէ բան փոխել է, չէ, դրանից հետո նշանակում է մի հատ էլ է չէ կանչում, որովհետեւ հասկանա այդ մեթոդի մեջ բան փոխել է, թե չէ։
Okay, նայ։ Ինքը որ գիտի, որ սկոպը փոխվել է, չէ։ Because it's drama, what you have to
Drama.
Wow, I shot it. I think ոչ միայն թանկը, շատ թանկը։ I think ինքը երկու անգամ է կանչում, ամեն կանչվելու ժամանակ։ Minimum։
Ու այդ իրականում եւ կարա ցիկլիկ է, այսինքն քանի անգամ
ինքը անընդհատ փոխվի, կանչի փոխվի։ Ինչ փոխվի։ Սրա մեջ փոխենք սկոպը։ Так, ուրեմն եկեք dollar scope-ին dot num bank. Եկեք ստեղ ուրեմն dollar scope dot num plus plus. Yep, the bank num is dollar scope dot num. Եվ որպեսի infinite loop չլինի, եկեք sense բան անենք. If dollar scope dot num is greater than 10, եկեք return անենք խոսենք. Oh, check պրծնի, ճիշտ ես ասում. Okay. Is, okay, moment. Dollar scope dot it's got my error done. Oh. Digesting it, yeah, դուք լավ դիմաք, կարելի է digesting it սեքրեմա տանում։ Հետո է կարծում երկրորդ անգամ ամեն մեկի համար ու կարծում է արդեն վերջին արժեքը, որը 11 է։ Հնարավոր է տենց։
Բայց digesting it սեքրեմա
Եկեք դեպքն հանեք էլի։
Լավ։ Եկեք ուրիշ Հիմա չգիտեմ ինչ անեմ, օքեյ է, թե շարունակենք։ Հիմա ինչ, չգիտեմ, պատասխան չունեմ, որ ես պետք է նստել ու բոլորը ուսումնասիրել եւ image ILOs. Image ILOs. This is a great time, by the way, for me to say this. So there are lots of these minute questions that we keep asking, right? If you know the answer, or you learn about the answer, please, and I really mean this, please write a blog about it. Or make a video about it, or do something to contribute to me, to Georg, to everybody. And not just us, but to everybody around the world. Okay? Think about how often we use Stack Overflow to get answers. Think about how often we read other people's blogs to learn and to educate ourselves. Right? All those YouTube videos that we're watching of people talking about, Node and Mongo and so on, right? There are people all over the world who are contributing to the global knowledge, right? Be a part of that. Be part of the community. Don't just read and sort of copy and paste code and forget about it. Be part of the conversation and contribute. Trust me, it's to your benefit as much as it is to the people who will read it. Okay, now. Okay, so this is the same example. But here we have some validation. So in the previous one, if we go back here, I can just add, okay. Anyways, okay, that's that's not what I want to show you, but okay. So with validation, notice how the add button is disabled. Watch this. Oh. Add kochaki nae, kushadish. Esak? Nima kayla kıkanen. Nima kanenarak kıkanen. Nima kayla kıkanen. Right? İrakanım disable the bottom feature. Bootstrap style alma, ha, as bootstrap, as him bootstrap features. Երկու կետ, ասում եմ, սպալոցը կեր։ Բայց այդ չի կարևորը։ Կարևորը validation-ի այդ համակարգն է, որ կա ուրեմն Angular։ And Angular ոնց անում validation։ So in this case, we still have my form, so ng submit add new item, that does not change. That's exactly the same as in the previous example. But I'm going to give my form a name, which I will call my form. Okay? So I give it a name, I call it my form. And then in here I have this input. The first thing I want to do is do an ng model. What does ng model do? Read write. So it reads from text and writes to text belonging to new item inside of the local scope. Right? But then there are these extra things that I'm putting in here, like ng max length, ng required. And there are a list of these. There are even places where you can put your own regular expressions. You guys remember what regular expressions are, right? It's this text that tries to match against another piece of text. And if it does not match, it's invalid. In Angular, we'll do some fancy things. And we will look at what those fancy things are now. So one of the things we can do is Angular has this directive or property called ng-show. What do you think ng-show does? So it has some value, and if it's truthy, it will be visible. If it's falsy, it will be hidden. Okay? So ng-show will show it if this expression returns truthy. What are the truthy values? No, undefined.
Not undefined.
Huh? False? Very funny. Urish. Man, empty string? 0. 0. False. Empty string. Null. Undefined. Nam. In no particular order. Okay? Those are falsy. Everything else is truthy. Right? Okay, remember this. Good. So, what we can do in Angular, right, is we can refer to our form, which we've given a name up here. You guys see this? We gave our form a name, and we can refer to it here. We can then refer to new item. We can refer to new item, which is the object that we're attaching text to. Okay, this is our data, which has attributes. In this case, only has text. That will have a reserved attribute on it from Angular called $error. $error is an object which can have attached to it a number of attributes. One of the attributes we're going to check is required. Required will either be true, truthy, I should say, or falsy. So, if this expression is falsy, then we are going to hide. If it's truthy, only then will we show this. So, if error required is true, that means that there's an error in this constraint of the block. You guys follow this? Okay, again, if new item has a required error, then we need to show required field. See this? That's what it is. The moment we fulfill that requirement, ng-show is now falsy, it is now hidden. ng-show is truthy, ng-show is falsy. ng-show is truthy, ng-show is falsy. Got it? Good. Then, we have this other one, which has the similar syntax, my form, new item, $error, max length. This is saying, is max length truthy or falsy? Well, if max length has an error, in other words, if I put in too many characters, it is truthy. The moment I put fewer characters, falsy. Truthy, falsy. Truthy, falsy. Got it? Yes. Put 0 where? Why? Why would it be? Okay, look. Max length is defining the number of characters in this value. That's max length. Required just means you can't have, that length cannot be 0. This is a string that has 1 character in it. Okay, so we got that. Now, here's my favorite part. I like this a lot. For this button, we can add ng disable. Okay? And what you do is you just pick my form, $invalid. When $invalid is truthy, you know that there is something in your form that is invalid, and therefore the entire form is invalid. Right? If you have just one error in your form, the entire form is invalid. You should not be able to submit a form that has any errors in it. Right? So if we have even a single error inside of $invalid, we want to disable our button. However, if $invalid is falsy, in other words, our form is valid, then and only then does this not run, and our button is now enabled. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, we get this functionality, and that functionality, and this functionality, and that functionality. Չգիտեմ, չեմ խորացել, բայց այդ... Ես ենթարը, բայց ասեմ հին բրազիլների հետ էլ աշխատում, ինչքան գիտեմ, որ չեմ շուտ ինչ էր եմ? Չէ, գայլի, հարդոմս, միշտ գայլի ասենք Chrome բանը բացել ու փոխելը ու we'll talk about this when we get to security, where the browser cannot be trusted, which is what you just said, exactly. But we'll get to that later. Բայց ուրիշ հարցեր կան?
Regular expression.
Կա։ Ուղղակի կոնկրետ այս բանին ես անգիր չեմ հիշում, ինչ attribute-ի անունն է, բայց հարկովս կա, documentation մեջ կարդացեք։ Հա? ng pattern. Okay? ng pattern. ng pattern, okay? John. Schön, Sonja, das. Geil, ja. İKAS, Sona. Hi. Ուրիշ հարց ունեք, որ Սոնա պատասխան։ Okay?
Մի հատ բան ասեմ, էլի։
Դեսում։
Այս ֆորմի մեջ, որ add new item-ը submit-ին տված։ Form-ի ng submit-ը։
Սպասի, այս։
Այդ new item-ը ու այն կոդի մեջի են error-ի new item-ը տարբեր են։ Ուղղակի անունը
Անունն է ուղղակի։ Պատի որ
ինքը ամեն ֆորմի համար scope-ում ավելացնում է այդ ֆորմի անունով ատրիբուտ։ Այդ my form-ը ինքը ավտոմատ scope-ին ավելացնում։ Այսինքն կարելի է գրել scope get my form get հետո get-ից հետո արդեն input-ի name-ով ավելացնում։ Այսինքն այդ new item-ը իրականում հենց scope new item-ն է, որը կապ չունի այս scope my form new item-ի հետ, էլի։
Okay։ Շատ շնորհակալություն։ Շատ զիջի։ Ուրիշ հարցեր կամ կոմենտներ չկա։ Okay։ Եկեք շարունակենք, անցնա։ 7 րոպե։ Okay։ Okay, ժողովուրդ, նայեք։ Ուրեմն միջև այս մենք օգտագործում ենք controller-ները հետևյալ ձևով։ Նայեք, այս controller-ն է, որին մենք refer ենք անում we're referring to that controller from our HTML here, right? ng controller to do's, right? What's wrong with this code? For those of you who were not talking to me 5 minutes ago, what's wrong with that code? Huh? I thought I heard it. Yeah. To-dos is global. And one of the things I always say is, don't put things in the global scope. Remember? Okay. So what is the right way to do this? Well, that is the right way to do this. So first of all, always try to wrap your code into a self-executing function. Just like we saw that jQuery did the same thing, right? They did that, and they also they were passing in window here, so that window would be local and it would be compressible, and you wouldn't have a problem of any of the global variables getting overridden by some idiot, right? Okay. So now, anything that we put in here, any variables, will be limited to the scope. Okay? So here's what we're doing here. All of your controllers and other things that we will study, like directives and things like that, should be attached to what is referred to as a module. Now, a module in Angular is not a module the way you've seen in maybe AMD, RequireJS, or whatever. All a module is a place to put things that are related. Okay? That's all a module is. It's just a spot where you put related items. Things that have to do with each other. Okay? So, we're going to create a module. We give it a name. This is the module name, which I'm just calling demo. And then you can give it an array of dependent modules. Don't worry about this for now, but later we will see that you can actually use other modules in your code, right? So whenever you want to use another library from Angular, typically it will be another module that you will include, and then include the name of the module here. And now your module will know about that module and allow you to use it inside of here. Okay? Okay, so we made our module. There it is. Now we want to add a controller. Now, the typical pattern in Angular, whenever you're registering something, is you give it a name, and then you give it the value. Okay? Name, value. So, we want to register a controller. Okay? So we do demo.controller, the name of the thing, and the value of the thing. So in this case, the name is my scope, the name of the controller, and the value is the controller itself. It's the function, right? Which is going to take $scope and then add Joe to name that is inside of scope. We've seen this before. The only difference is in the past, we declared this function in the global scope and then used it. Here, we're actually registering this controller with this module. You guys see the difference? Okay. So then, once we've done this, we've created a module. Once we've registered a controller with our module, we are now ready to begin processing our HTML. And that is why we do Angular.bootstrap. Okay? Because rather than doing ng-app, which immediately runs, maybe there's a set timeout thing that Gabriel mentioned, but this is very explicit. This is saying initialize your code and then run Angular. It's very obvious. And so this will then go to main. We'll go to main and begin processing. And now this controller is registered with the module, so no problem. So it knows to find that in here. One nuance you might have noticed is when I call bootstrap, I give it the module to use. So this module and any of the dependent modules are good. You can use them inside of your application relative to that node. Module steptății. Module steptății controller, Angular nasek IS vecru procesara, yet oktagossi IS module. Այսինքն, երբ որ ինքը գտնում է my scope, ինքը նայում է S module-ի մեջ, գտնում է, օգտագործում է սա, կարդում է, ստանում է այս scope-ը, այս name-ը կարդում է, քանի որ ng model name, կարդում է ստեղից, John դնում է input-ի մեջ։ Սա կարդում է նույնպես name-ը, John դնում է ստեղ։ Եվ երբ որ ապագայում այս input-ը փոխում է name-ը, նա գրում է, փոխում է այս name արժեքը scope-ի, Դիֆ-արգում, այսինքն կարող է դիֆը չի երարվում, քանի որ ինքը գիտի, որ դա է փոխվել, բայց կարճ ասած, որ փոխում է, ապետը կրակում է և ինքը update անում սա, և ցանկացած ուրիշ watch expression, որ կարող է կապված լինի այդ լին։ Okay, John. Նույն անունով control տարբեր մոդուլների մեջ։ Փորձել եք, ես չեմ փորձել, դա մտքի կարելի է։
Եթե կարան չած ուրիշ հարցեր, երբում որ հստակ կանոնշման
դե ինքը array է, that's why իրականում կարելի է ցուցակներ ես։
մի քանի հատիկ կային, ու արդեն գրել նույն անունով սփոփ տարբեր մոդուլներ։
Այդ եկում collision կդի, չէ՞, բայց ես դրա համար ենթադրում եմ, որ չնայած կարող է իրակ թողում են, իրականում մեկը կհաղթի։ Բարև չէ՞։ Եթե նույն անունով է, ասենք collision է դա։ Ասում ես նույն այսպես վիճակ, այսպես, ուղղակի մեջին լան տարբեր։ Գտնվում է երկու տարբեր մոդուլներով։ Եթե երկու մոդուլներն ինժեկտ անեք այս վիճակում, հա? Դեմո ստորակեք մի հատ ուրիշ մոդուլ, որը որ ունի նույն controller tank։ Okay, sense ասեմ, ժամը 12-ն է, մարդիկ գործի պետք է գնան։ Ով որ ուզում է հետազոտություն անի, ես կմնամ եկեք խաղանք իրար հետ։ Ով որ չի ուզում, ժողովուրդ ջան, շատ ուժադիր։ Հաջորդ շաբաթ մենք չեք հանում։ Okay, հաջորդ շաբաթ ես գործեր ունեմ, 1000 ներողություն։ Հաջորդ շաբաթ, այսինքն այդ ինչ է, հա, ամսի ինչ է։ 28 Tuesday։ Ամսի վերջին։ Ինչ է։ 29 կլինի մեր հաջորդ հանդիպում։ Okay։ Երբ որտեղ որ մենք կշարունակենք Angular-ի այս բաները, կհասնենք dependency injection-ով, director-ներով, routing-ով։ Եկա մի հատ դաշտ կա, որտեղ չենք կապել։ Ներողություն որ չհասցրեցինք, ուղղակի սենց է, էլի։ Նյութերը շատ են։ Հետո դրանից հետո կմտնենք Node-ի մեջ, հետո MongoDB-ի մեջ, դա MapReduce-ով, սարքապես բաներով։ Հետո կանցնենք security, performance ու clean code ու երևի չոր ուրիշ մի քանի բան, եթե հավես ունենալ կամ ես ունենամ ու դրանով մենք ավարտենք ու կհանդիպենք տարբեր հետաքրքիր վայրերում։ Okay, շատ շնորհակալություն։
Կամերան դրես ու գնաս։
Ոնց է անհատը դեզ այդպես։
Գնա կամերա հետ է ֆասա։ Դա դու կորեն ես ֆասակես։ I don't put pichom.
Ճաշարանեք։ Դուրս եկեք մեկ։
Լուզով կա, հա։
Ժողովուրդ, ինչ-որ մեկը պայսակ է մոռացել։ Ավելի